Okay, so this is going to be our virtual field trip, iHistory version 2020 field trip number 3. And I decided to do something a little bit more local, and it's Lancaster. And when we all oftentimes think of Lancaster, we think of, sadly, the outlets, right, in Amish country. But what we're going to focus on today is actually Lancaster City. We're going to be focusing on the history of Lancaster City, and there's a ton of history here. You know, the earliest settlers in this area were in the very early 1700s. They were Mennonites that settled along the Conestoga River near Chester County. But in the late 1720s, there was a gentleman named John Wright. He was a Quaker who bought some land and near what's today Columbia on the Columbia River, not too far from Lancaster City, and named it after his home county in England, and that was Lancashire, and that's where the term Lancaster County comes from. So we're going to be doing a tour of the city of Lancaster and all the history that is only about an hour or so from us in Westchester. Okay, so here we are in the heart of downtown Lancaster. This is Penn Square. And in the center, we've got the Soldiers and Sailors Monument here, which was erected in 1874 to honor those who fought in the Civil War. It's got 4 statues around the base, as you can sort of see here. One represents each of the 4 branches of the military. So there's one for the infantry, the artillery, cavalry, and navy. And at the top, you've got the Genius of Liberty, who faces north, obviously, because that is the direction of Lancaster, Pennsylvania side during the Civil War. And actually in this same exact spot, between 1738 and 1853, there was a courthouse that stood right in this middle area here. And in 1744, the Treaty of Six Nations between Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and 6 Middle Atlantic Native American tribes negotiated and signed a treaty inside a courthouse that would have stood right in the middle of this area. And then, believe it or not, it was the nation's capital for one day. On September 27, 1777, the Continental Congress actually met here, which would have been a courthouse again in 1777, as Congress was fleeing Philadelphia when the British took over Philadelphia on their way to York. So it served as a capital for one day on September 27, 1777. This is the visitor center today. This actually was the old city hall, and it was built in 1795, and today it's a heritage museum, but originally it served as Pennsylvania's capital between 1799 and 1812. And then just down this little alleyway, you've got the Central Market, which is the oldest active central market in the United States. There was originally a public market here, is dating back as far as 1730. The current building here dates to 1889, and it is a public market on the weekends. So we're not going to go in, but maybe I can do a quick little picture as I walk down this little alleyway. I'm afraid it might be a little too crowded, so we're not going to go in, but maybe I can get a picture as people go in. So think of it as like maybe Reading Terminal Market, maybe just a little bit smaller though. So cool spot here. So looking back at it the other direction there, the tall building actually was built in 1925. It's called the Grice Building. It was a skyscraper in, well, terms of the early 20th century here in Lancaster, and is the tallest, second tallest, I should say, building in the city. So across from Penn Square here, where there is the large Fulton Bank today, would have in the 18th century stood the home of Robert Fulton, who was one of the greatest innovators in American history. He was born in southern Lancaster County. I can show you some pictures of his house. I drove there this summer on just sort of a day trip. Can't tell you it's all that exciting. It's just a beautiful old 18th century house. But after he was born in southern Lancaster County, they actually moved to Lancaster here, and he would have lived across the street of Penn Square, where this big bank is today. And his most famous invention, and we'll talk about it later this year, was the first steamship in the world. It was named the Claremont. And then across the street here, it's a Marriott today. It would have been a department store in the 19th and the 20th century. But in the 1750s until about 1924, this was the site of the White Swan Hotel. So directly behind me is the home of Jasper Yates. Jasper Yates was a member of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787 and a Pennsylvania Supreme Court Justice, and this was his home, and it was built in 1765. And then behind me here, this is kind of cool, it's part of the Pennsylvania Convention Center, I should say Lancaster Convention Center, and it's the home of, it's known as the Montgomery House, and it was built by a lawyer in Lancaster named William Montgomery. It dates to the early 1800s, about 1804 or so, and it is actually currently part of the convention center. I'm going to try to get inside if there's nobody in there and show you how they've kind of incorporated the outside of the home inside the convention center. So now we are inside the Lancaster Convention Center, and as you can see here is the back of the house of Mr. Montgomery. Facing the street outside is the front, and then here is the back of the house that they've incorporated as part of the convention center. So a great use of early 19th century architecture, federal architecture inside a very modern building. Okay, what we have here, literally just a couple of yards here from the Pennsylvania Convention Center, is the home of Thaddeus Stevens, who was an incredibly important Pennsylvania congressman of the 19th century. Somebody who worked tirelessly to get the 13th and the 14th Amendments passed to the Constitution, abolishing slavery and then offering citizenship to all natural-born citizens with equal protection under the law. And this is where he would have lived as a member of Congress between 1843 and 1868, when he died in 1868. So a very important Pennsylvanian, Thaddeus Stevens. And now the home of Lydia Hamilton Smith, who was an African-American woman, but a free African-American woman, who became a collaborator with Thaddeus Stevens. She was a business manager. She was a conductor for the Underground Railroad, and these homes were probably part of the Underground Railroad, and was a very close confidant of Thaddeus Stevens, and as some people might speculate, even somebody that Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith having a, we'll say, romantic relationship with one another as well, which is certainly possible. About a block from here, half block from here, would have actually been where Milton Hershey began his confectionery business. Today it's a parking lot, but in 1886 it would have been a factory known as the Lancaster Carmel Company, and it would have worked and produced caramels and candies that he would have sold at the market before moving out to what is now Hershey, Pennsylvania. In front of us here is the Evangelical Lutheran Church of the Holy Trinity, and the congregation began in about 1730, but this church was built in 1767. It is the only surviving house of worship erected during the colonial period here in Lancaster, and the steeple was added in 1794. Well, I'll try to go inside. I doubt it'll be too crowded on this fall Saturday, because on the inside there is actually a pipe organ that at the time was the largest pipe organ installed in any church in America, and it was installed in 1774. It's locked. There's also inside a stained glass window that was done in 1913. It's called the Crucifixion, and it was done by Louis Comfort Tiffany and Company. I talked about him on a Philadelphia field trip when he did the garden that was done by Maxville Parish, the painting. So he did a mosaic of stained glass work here as well in 1913. But we can't go in. Maybe another day. So these homes here are some of the older ones in Lancaster, and they date back to the 1760s. And in front of me is the Tamuth tobacco shop, which is the oldest operating tobacco shop in America. It was last renovated in 1917, and it was the Demuth family that owned it in the early 20th century. And just on the other side of us over here is going to be the Demuth Foundation, which kind of celebrates the famous American watercolorist Charles Demuth, who lived here between 1883 and 1935. And there's a garden in there as well that maybe we can go back and take a look at. Okay, so here we are at the home of Charles Demuth, that famous watercolorist of the modernist movement of the early 20th century. I actually used to live in a house in Marshallton that was owned by a famous art critic of the turn of the 20th century. His name was Henry McBride. He wasn't an artist himself, but he was an art critic in New York City and was good friends with Charles Demuth. So I suspect he spent some time here in the 20th century as well. So very famous watercolorist Charles Demuth and the Charles Demuth Foundation here. So today it's a museum and a little garden area. Here's a mid-18th century house by a well-known botanist, one of the earliest botanists here in America, and a reverend of a very famous family that settled Pennsylvania, the Muhlenbergs. Originally, it would have served as a parsonage for Holy Trinity Lutheran Church just down the street, but living here would have been a well-known, as I said, botanist and Reverend Gottlieb Heinrich Ernst Muhlenberg. It's the Muhlenberg family here, and this is where Henry Muhlenberg would have lived in the 18th century. Although they certainly don't go together, my field trips tend to include both graveyards and, of course, ice cream. So here we are in St. James Episcopal Church's graveyard, and a couple of notable people that are buried in here, including Edward Shippen, who's was the father-in-law to Benedict Arnold. His daughter, Peggy Shippen, married Benedict Arnold. Also included in here, George Ross, who signed the Declaration of Independence, and Jasper Yates, who signed the Constitution. And then across the street here, I know it's a little bit hard to see, but you can see the steeple here, would be First Presbyterian Church, which was erected in 1851, and a couple of notable members of that church included both Thaddeus Stevens, a congressman, and James Buchanan, the 15th President of the United States. So the city of Lancaster has had a bit of a renaissance over the last decade or so with all of the art galleries, and here we are in Gallery Row, and trendy restaurants that we'll be walking by shortly. So another view of some of the art galleries here on Prince Street. The main streets in downtown Lancaster are named King Street, Queen Street, and Prince Street. And actually, King Street was the first turnpike chartered in the United States in 1792. And eventually it would become Lancaster Highway, but they would serve as roadways, major roadways in and out of Philadelphia. So here I am at the back of the Fulton Theater, and I'll show you what that looks like when I get around to it. But I'm on the back end of it on Water Street. And as you can see here, it's a brick building, but the foundation of it is actually a stone wall. And this stone wall dates back to probably sometime around 1753, because it was actually the county prison between 1753 and 1851. And in 1763, there was a local Native American, Conestoga Native American tribe that was actually within the prison because they feared for their lives after a vigilante group of white settlers destroyed their villages, and they were trying to find protection from within the stone walls. But on Sunday morning, December 27th, 1763, the Paxton Gang from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, broke into the prison and massacred the remaining Native Americans that were inside. So a tragic history here within the county prison that was open for about 100 years between 1750s until about 1850. As I walk up King Street here, we're going to pass by the house of Major General John Reynolds, who was born in Lancaster in 1820 and was a major general during the Civil War for the Union and was the first general killed at the Battle of Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863. I'll talk more about him later this year. Here we are at Steinman Park, a nice little quiet alcove in downtown Lancaster. And as you can see here, there's a restaurant, the Press Room Restaurant and Bar, but that actually used to be an old hardware store. In fact, it was at one point the oldest hardware store in America. It was founded in 1744, and it was open all the way until 1965. But today, it's currently a restaurant. So we'll head back out to the main strip, and we'll do one last stop before taking in the final sights and sounds of downtown Lancaster. And it would have been right in this spot, in this area right here, where you would have had Francis Bailey's print shop. And Francis Bailey was a printer who worked for both the United States Congress and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. He worked here for about 7 years and was actually the first to do imprints of Thomas Paine's The Crisis and an original copy of the Articles of Confederation when the Continental Congress met here in 1777. So my final stop here in the city of Lancaster is going to be at Wheatland, which was James Buchanan's home. Our 15th president lived here in Lancaster. He was from Lancaster, and I'll give you a tour of the outside of his house here for just a second. president number 15. He was the president before Abraham Lincoln. He was the president as our country unraveled. And I've done the tour here. It's the Lancaster County Historical Society that does it. And it's a fascinating tour. When it's post-COVID times, I would certainly suggest it, but we're not going to go inside today. But they don't gild the truth here. They certainly understand that James Buchanan was a controversial president and was somebody that most historians look at as being one of our worst presidents. Our only president that actually lived here in Pennsylvania while he was president, Joe Biden, president-elect, was from Scranton, Pennsylvania. Dwight Eisenhower lived here after he was president out in Gettysburg. But James Buchanan is truly our only president, and as most historians agree, was really one of the worst. Not because of anything he did, it was more because of things that he did not do, and that was kind of hold the Union together as it was being ripped apart north and south. So you can see the house behind me here. We'll do a quick walk around. Okay, so here we go. We're approaching President James Buchanan's house, Wheatland. You can hear the crunching of the leaves under me here. It is an absolutely beautiful home. James Buchanan, it wasn't that he didn't have any political background. He certainly did. He was incredibly qualified for the presidency when he won the election of 1856. He would be a one-term president. He was dropped by the Democratic ticket in 1860. In 1860, the Democratic ticket was split among a number of people, which sort of allowed Abraham Lincoln as the first Republican president to gain the presidency, because the Democratic ticket was split between Bell and Breckinridge and even Stephen Douglas. So Abraham Lincoln will eventually become the president afterwards, but James Buchanan, a one-term president. Now, his presidency isn't necessarily all that interesting, but there is actually somebody that is incredibly interesting about him. He was never married. James Buchanan was a bachelor his entire life. He did get engaged, or at least tried to get engaged at one point, and I'll tell that story another day, but never did marry. So our only bachelor president. But he did have a niece that was essentially the socialite of Washington when he was president, and her name was Harriet Lane. And Harriet Lane befriended everybody. She was the hit of every party that the Buchanans put on, and she lived here as well. So Harriet Lane lived here as well, and I can talk a little bit more about her when I put this video together, and I can show some images of her. But Queen Victoria, the Queen of England, was incredibly close to her, and anytime Harriet Lane visited England, she had to call on the Queen, because the Queen really enjoyed their friendship. So here we are at the home of James Buchanan, Wheatland. It was a home that was built in 1828. It sort of transitioned two architectural periods. You can see elements of both the Federal period and the Greek Revival period here at the home. It was built in 1828, right at the turn, at the cusp of those two periods, at the end of the Federal period, at the beginning of the Greek Revival period. It was commissioned by a Lancaster banker named William Jenkins, and eventually the property became part of James Buchanan's estate as he purchased it. And he lived here and ran the 1856 campaign in which he won the presidency from this home, and actually gave speeches from the front porch of his home right here in Lancaster. So, one final look at Wheatland. You see here the ice house and the smokehouse. You see his gardens that he had. His favorite food, believe it or not, was sauerkraut. That sort of disgusts me, but he enjoyed sauerkraut, so the gardeners here would sometimes grow cabbage to make the sauerkraut. So we are going to do one final stop. I don't know what it is. I'm a little bit like one of Pavlov's dogs, I guess, in that anytime I do a history trip, I need ice cream. So to satiate my desire for ice cream, we're going to make one final stop. I hope you guys have enjoyed this tour of Lancaster and the surrounding areas, and we'll have to find somewhere exciting to go for the next stop, our next virtual tour. See you all soon. So I'm in the little town of Strasbourg, just outside of Lancaster, and as all field trips have to come to a conclusion, so will this one, but not without ice cream.